The day I first stepped into Rafik's workshop, the air was thick with the scent of motor oil and old rain. It clung to the walls, to the cracked windows, to the breath that left your mouth heavier than when it entered. The building itself looked as if it had been standing long before the town around it learned its own name. Its bricks blackened by time, its roof sagging under the weight of years. The sign outside still read, Rafik and Sons Auto Repairs. Though there was no son, no one but him, and the faded ampersand looked like it was barely holding on. He didn't look up when I entered. Just a brief tilt of the head, a flicker of acknowledgement that was more mechanical than polite. He was working on an old Datsun, its hood propped open like a chest cavity. I stood there awkwardly, hands buried in my pockets, unsure whether to speak or wait. Then he said, without turning, "You're late." His voice was rough, worn like sandpaper, but there was something underneath it, a kind of quiet that didn't come from peace, but from exhaustion. I told him I didn't know where to start. He wiped his hands on a rag, looked me over once, then pointed toward a tool bench littered with wrenches and bolts. "Start there," he said. That was our introduction. For days, I barely understood what I was doing. My fingers blistered from the metal, my clothes carried the smell of grease even after washing, and my pride eroded faster than the rust we tried to scrape off old fenders. Rafik spoke only when necessary. Tighter. Wrong size. Again. Every word felt like it had to earn its way out of his mouth. But beneath the silence, there was a rhythm to his world. The hum of engines, the hiss of steam, the click of sockets finding their fit. It was like a language, and slowly I began to learn it. Sometimes I'd catch him staring out the open garage door at nothing in particular. The road, the sky, the way dust rose when trucks passed. His face would harden, then soften, then turn back to the work. I didn't ask what he was thinking, but there was a gravity about him. Something that made you feel like every small gesture carried a lifetime behind it. He never laughed. He never cursed. But when something went wrong with an engine, when a piston jammed or a valve refused to seal, you could feel his frustration in the air. He'd stop, breathe, and then fix it with a precision that made it look almost tender. One evening after closing, I stayed behind to clean. The workshop was dim except for a single hanging bulb that buzzed faintly. I found a photograph tucked behind a pile of invoices, a younger Rafik standing beside another man who looked just like him, smiling, hands greasy, holding up a wrench like a trophy. The name on the back said, Rafik and Adil, 1999. When he walked in and saw it in my hand, his expression changed, a flash of something between anger and pain. "Put that down," he said quietly. I obeyed. He didn't explain, and I didn't ask. But from that night on, his silence carried a different kind of weight. He began to trust me in small ways. One morning, he let me handle a carburetor on my own. It was simple, but to me it felt like being handed a secret. "Don't force it," he said. Machines don't like anger. I didn't understand what he meant until much later. That day, as the sunlight hit the dust in the air and turned it to gold, I realized something. He wasn't teaching me about cars. He was teaching me about control, patience, and the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout. The customers came and went, always the same faces. A bus driver needing a quick fix, a woman with a dented bumper, a boy with a bike chain that wouldn't stay on. They all seemed to treat Rafik with the same mixture of gratitude and unease. Nobody lingered, nobody asked questions. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear voices outside, men speaking low, serious, words too muffled to catch but tense enough to chill the air. Once, when I looked out, I saw him hand something small and folded to a man in a leather jacket. They nodded to each other, and the man drove away without headlights. When I asked about it the next morning, he said only, "You fix the car in front of you. Don't worry about the ones already gone." There were moments, though, when his guard slipped. One afternoon, while replacing brake pads, he stopped and said, almost to himself, "Every machine breaks the same way, slowly, then all at once." He looked at me then, as if measuring whether I understood. I didn't. Not yet. Summer rolled on, and so did the days, each one folding into the next like gears locking into motion. The workshop became a second home, a place that smelled of fatigue and quiet redemption. Rafiq still never smiled, but sometimes when I got something right, his eyes softened in a way that felt like approval. It wasn't affection, not exactly. More like recognition, like he saw something of himself in me that neither of us wanted to name. It wasn't until the night of the storm that I began to sense what he'd been hiding. The rain came hard, slamming against the roof, thunder cracking like old bones. We stayed late, trying to finish a repair before morning. When the power cut out, lightning lit up the room for a split second, just long enough for me to see the outline of a gun, half buried beneath a rag on his work table. And in that flash, I realized the truth. The man who fixed things for a living might be running from something he couldn't fix at all. That night, as the rain fell and the engines cooled, I understood that every lesson Rafiq had given me, about patience, about silence, about machines, was leading somewhere far darker. I just didn't know yet how deep it went, or how much it would cost both of us when it finally came undone. Morning always arrived slowly in Rafiq's workshop. Like the sun itself was reluctant to pass through those smoke-stained windows. The silence between us had grown thicker since that storm. Not cold, but weighted, as if we were both pretending nothing had changed. I tried not to think about the gun I'd seen, though its shape lived behind my eyes every time I closed them. He never mentioned it, never gave any sign that he knew I'd noticed. But sometimes, when his hand reached beneath the table for a wrench, I'd catch the faint hesitation, the pause of a man who was used to remembering what he'd hidden, and why. The days became a rhythm of clattering tools and half-spoken lessons. He'd correct my grip, adjust the torque, nod once when I got it right. But behind each motion, I sensed something unsaid, like a word caught in his throat for years. One afternoon, as I was cleaning a carburetor, I finally asked, "Who was Adil?" The name hung in the air like smoke. Rafiq froze. His hands stopped moving, his shoulders locked tight. Then, without looking at me, he said, "Someone who didn't know when to stop asking questions." And that was it. No explanation, no anger, just a warning disguised as memory. I didn't ask again. Still, curiosity doesn't die easily. It lingers like rust, spreading even when you think you've scrubbed it away. I started watching him more closely, the way he'd tense whenever a police car passed by, how he always kept the radio low but tuned to the news. Once, a man came in with a black SUV, the kind that didn't belong in our part of town. Rafiq fixed his car in complete silence while the man leaned against the wall, staring at me too long, his eyes sharp, assessing. When they finished, Rafiq slipped something into the man's glove compartment, and the man drove off without paying. "Some debts aren't written in money," he muttered afterward. I didn't understand then, but the edge in his tone told me not to press. That night, I dreamed of the photograph again, Rafiq and Adil, the way they smiled without fear. I wondered what could twist that kind of light into the shadow I now saw in his eyes. The next morning, when I arrived early, I found him sitting outside the shop, cigarette burning low between his fingers, eyes distant. "You think silence means peace," he said suddenly without looking at me. "But silence is just a place where guilt catches its breath." His words settled into me like dust, fine and inescapable. As the summer deepened, so did my unease. Rafiq had begun disappearing some nights after closing, locking the gate behind him, leaving me with the lingering echo of his footsteps. He'd return before dawn, his shirt damp with sweat, his expression harder than before. I wanted to believe he was just restless, that his ghosts were only memories. But one night, when I stayed behind pretending to finish paperwork, I saw him meet someone outside, a man in a suit, far too polished for our broken town. They exchanged a small metal box, quick and deliberate, no words spoken. Rafiq's face was unreadable, carved in stone. After the man left, he stood there for a long while, staring into the dark as if trying to see the end of something that had already begun. The next day, he was different. Quieter, slower, his mind somewhere else entirely. While fixing an engine, he sliced his hand open, deep enough that blood pooled fast. I rushed to help, but he waved me off, wrapping it himself with a strip of old cloth. "Pain reminds you you're still paying," he said through clenched teeth. It was only later, when I saw the faint tremor in his left hand, that I realized it wasn't the cut that hurt him most. It was the memory it carried. A week later, the police came by. 2 officers, polite but probing, asked if we'd seen a certain car. Rafiq stayed calm, his voice low, controlled. "We fix cars, not chase them," he said. They left after a few questions, but the moment they were gone, he exhaled like a man who'd been holding his breath for years. I wanted to ask what was happening, but when our eyes met, I saw something that stopped me. Not fear, but resignation. Like a man who knew his past was already on its way back, and all he could do was wait for it to arrive. The silence between us changed after that. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of secrets, of regret, of things too heavy for words. Yet, in that quiet, he began teaching me differently. He spoke about patience not as a skill, but as survival. About how machines never lie, but people always do. "You can fix a car because it wants to work," he said once, "but you can't fix a man who's decided he's beyond repair." I didn't realize then that he was talking about himself. Sometimes, when the light hit just right, I'd see the scar along his jaw, thin but deliberate, the kind that wasn't made by accident. I thought of all the times he flinched at sudden noises, the way his eyes darted to shadows like a soldier scanning for danger. Whatever he'd done, whatever a deal had been part of, it wasn't just history. It was still alive, beating beneath his calm exterior like an engine that refused to die. One evening, as I was locking up, he stopped me. "You don't have to keep coming here," he said. "You've learned enough." But his tone wasn't dismissive. It was protective. I told him I didn't want to leave, that this place, broken and small as it was, felt like something real. He looked at me for a long time before replying, "Real isn't always safe." That night, I couldn't sleep. The sound of the rain outside reminded me of the first storm, the one that had revealed his gun. I lay awake wondering what kind of life turns a man into a storm of his own making. And somewhere between the thunder and the silence, I realized the truth. I hadn't come to the workshop just to learn about engines. I'd come searching for a father I never had. And somehow, in his silence, Rafiq had become one, though neither of us would ever dare to say it aloud. The next morning, everything would change. I just didn't know yet that the past he was running from was already on its way back, and this time, it wouldn't leave quietly. It began with the sound of tires screeching outside, a sharp, violent cry that sliced through the morning calm. I was tightening a bolt when it happened, my hands trembling just slightly from lack of sleep. Rafiq didn't move at first. He just froze, wrench in hand, eyes narrowing as if he could already predict what waited beyond that half-open door. Then, with the kind of slowness that comes from dread rather than hesitation, he wiped his hands on a rag and walked toward the light spilling in from outside. 2 men stood by a black sedan, its paint catching the sun like liquid glass. One of them was tall, clean-shaven, the kind of man who looked out of place in a neighborhood like ours. Too sharp, too composed. The other leaned against the car, chewing on a toothpick, eyes restless, scanning. When Rafiq stepped out, the taller man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly one. "Long time," he said. The way he said it, smooth, deliberate, made my stomach tighten. Rafiq didn't smile back. "You shouldn't have come here." The man shrugged. "You stopped answering the calls." "I stopped because it's over." "Nothing's over, old friend." The man's voice softened, almost pitying. "You still owe what you owe. A deal's gone. You're not." At that name, a deal. I felt the air shift. Rafiq's expression barely changed, but something behind his eyes flickered, like a match catching fire. He stepped closer, voice low, controlled. "You say his name again, and you won't walk out of here." The man laughed, the kind of laugh that doesn't reach the eyes. "Still the same. Still pretending you're a man of peace, but we both know what's buried under these floors." He looked around, then spotted me standing just inside the doorway. "And this one? You teaching him to fix cars or to bury secrets?" Rafik turned sharply toward me. "Inside." The word cut through the air like a blade. I obeyed, retreating back into the dim workshop. But through the cracked window, I could still see them. 2 men circling an old wound. Their voices dropped low, carried only in fragments between the wind and the hum of the engines cooling in the yard. I caught pieces. Shipment, money, a deal's mess, last warning. Then the sound of something metallic hitting the ground, followed by Rafik's voice, steady but cold. "If you ever come back here, you'll regret it." The car left in a roar of dust and exhaust. When Rafik came back inside, his face was pale beneath the layer of oil and sweat. He didn't say a word, just picked up his wrench, as if the conversation outside had never happened. I wanted to ask who they were, what a deal had done, what he had done. But I didn't. Something about the way his hands shook ever so slightly told me the truth was better left unspoken. Days passed, though the silence between us no longer felt like before. It had turned into something brittle, ready to shatter. I worked quietly, pretending not to notice how often he checked the street, how he'd locked the door twice instead of once, how his eyes followed every car that slowed near the workshop. One evening, I stayed late to finish a repair. The sun was bleeding out behind the hills, and the sky looked like bruised metal. Rafik stood outside, smoking, his face caught in the fading light. "He was my brother," he said suddenly, voice so low I almost didn't hear. I turned. "A deal?" He nodded. "You asked before. That's who he was, my younger brother." He exhaled smoke, eyes fixed somewhere far away. "We started this place together. We built it with nothing but our hands. But he wanted more, faster. He started fixing cars for people you shouldn't even look at twice. Money came easy, but nothing clean ever lasts long." He paused, flicked the cigarette away. "When the police came, he took the fall for both of us, said he'd handle it. He never came back. There was nothing to say. The weight of it pressed against the walls, against my chest. After a while, I asked, 'The men today? They're from that time?' He didn't answer directly. 'You can't escape the things you build with dirty hands,' he said instead. 'They follow you, even when the engine's off.' That night, I couldn't shake the sound of that car outside, the look in the stranger's eyes. The world I thought I knew, of gears, of tools, of simple work and sweat, had cracked open to reveal something darker underneath. 2 nights later, it happened. The fire. I woke to the sound of shattering glass and shouting. By the time I reached the workshop, flames were already climbing up the walls, orange and wild, devouring everything we'd spent months building. Rafik was there, beating at the fire with his jacket, coughing, shouting for me to stay back. But I ran in anyway, the heat slapping against my face, the air thick with smoke. I saw him struggling to pull something from beneath a workbench, a metal box, small, locked. The same one I'd seen him hand off weeks ago. "Leave it," I shouted. He looked at me, eyes burning with more than smoke. "I can't." When the roof cracked and caved, the light from the flames washed over his face, not fear, but a strange kind of peace. I grabbed his arm, dragging him out as the ceiling collapsed behind us. Outside, the night glowed red, sparks rising like ghosts. The fire trucks came too late. By dawn, the workshop was nothing but charred steel and silence. Rafik sat on the EI, curb, soot streaking his skin, that metal box still clutched in his lap. He didn't cry. He just stared at what used to be his life and said, almost to himself, "It had to burn." I wanted to ask why, but his voice stopped me. "You learn something when you watch what you built go up in flames," he murmured. "You learn whether it was ever really yours." That was the last night I saw him for a long time. When the fire cooled and the ash settled, Rafik disappeared. No goodbyes, no explanations, just gone, leaving behind the faint smell of smoke and the echo of lessons I hadn't yet learned how to understand. But even as I stood there in the wreckage, watching the sun rise over the ruins of his workshop, I knew this wasn't the end. Men like Rafik don't vanish. They just hide until the world forgets how to look for them. And I wasn't ready to forget. Months passed after the fire, but the smell of burnt metal never left my memory. It lingered in my clothes, in my dreams, in the spaces between silence. The workshop had become a skeleton of blackened beams and twisted steel. And though I tried to move on, something in me stayed there, haunting the ruins the way ghosts haunt the places where their stories ended too soon. I told myself Rafik was gone for good, that whatever past he'd been trying to bury had finally swallowed him whole. But sometimes, at night, when I heard an engine echo down the street, I'd still half expect it to stop outside my window and for him to step out, wiping his hands on that same rag, pretending nothing had ever burned. I found work at another garage on the edge of town. Cleaner, busier, colder. The people there didn't speak in silences like Rafik had. They filled every space with noise, music, gossip, the sound of things that didn't matter. I learned to nod, to blend in, but every time I tightened a bolt or tuned an engine, I heard his voice in my head, quiet, but certain. "Don't force it." Machines don't like anger. I realized how much of him had seeped into me, not just in habit, but in the way I saw the world. Every broken engine became a person to me now, something wounded, something that still wanted to work if you only took the time to listen. Still, the questions wouldn't stop turning over inside me. Who had those men been? What was inside that metal box he'd risked his life to save? And most of all, why did he leave without a word? I tried to let it go, but it gnawed at me, whispering that maybe his story wasn't finished yet, that maybe some debts remain unpaid until someone else is willing to face them. It was late one evening when I saw him again, or thought I did. I was closing the garage when a car slowed by the curb. Old Toyota, dented bumper, headlights dim. For a second through the window, I caught the outline of a face, beard a little grayer, eyes heavier, but it was him. I froze, breath caught in my chest, but before I could move, the car rolled away into the fog. I ran out into the street, heart pounding, shouting his name. No answer. Only the sound of the night swallowing everything back into itself. After that, I couldn't shake the need to find him. I asked around. Old customers, supply drivers, anyone who might have known him. Most had heard nothing. A few said they thought he'd gone up north toward the hills, maybe working at some small-town repair shop under a different name. Others said he'd been seen at a scrapyard outside the city, living out of an old caravan. No one was sure, but each rumor carried a thread of truth, and I followed them, one by one, across miles of empty road. The scrapyard was where I finally caught up to him. It was dusk when I arrived, the horizon glowing like rusted gold. The air smelled of iron and rain. Among the wrecks of forgotten cars, I saw him. Older now, thinner, moving slower but still with that same precision, that same quiet grace. He was prying an engine apart when I called his name. For a moment, he didn't look up. Then, finally, he did. And for the first time, I saw a flicker of something almost like relief in his eyes. "You shouldn't have come," he said, the same way he had the first day we met. But his voice lacked the sharpness it once carried. It trembled slightly like a wall finally giving way. "I had to," I said. "You left without saying anything," he sighed, setting down his wrench. "Some things are easier to leave behind than explain." I stepped closer, studying his face. The lines had deepened, his beard now streaked with white, but the weight in his eyes was still there, an old sorrow that refused to fade. What happened that night? I asked quietly. Who were they? For a long time, he said nothing. Then he walked to a nearby crate and pulled something from his bag. The same metal box, dented now, its lock rusted but intact. This, he said, is all that's left of him. He set it down between us. My hands hesitated before I opened it. Inside were photos, old letters, a watch with a cracked face, and a folded newspaper clipping. The headline read, Mechanic Brothers caught in illegal transport ring. One missing, one at large. My stomach tightened. You took the blame? I whispered. He shook his head. No, he did. Adil thought he could fix everything by running. He thought if he disappeared, it would save us both. But when he vanished, they came for me. I tried to make things right. I thought paying what we owed would be enough. It never is. He paused, looking out toward the dark horizon. When they burned the shop, it wasn't about money anymore. It was about erasing what we built. I let it burn because maybe it deserved to. The silence that followed was heavier than words could carry. I realized then that forgiveness wasn't something Rafiq was waiting to receive. It was something he'd been trying to give himself, and failing. I thought you left because you didn't care, I said softly. He turned to me, eyes glinting under the fading light. I left because I cared too much. You reminded me of who I was before everything broke, and I couldn't let you become that. I wanted to tell him that it was too late, that his lessons had already changed me, that his silence had become part of the way I saw the world. But the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I sat beside him on the edge of the scrapyard, both of us watching the sky fade into night. He spoke once more before the darkness swallowed our faces. Every machine can be rebuilt, you know. But first, you have to forgive the one who broke it. He looked down at his hands, scarred and steady. I'm still working on that part. And for the first time since I'd known him, Rafiq smiled, barely, faintly, like a crack in the armor of a man who'd forgotten how. That night, when I left the scrapyard, I carried the smell of oil and rust on my skin. But something inside me felt lighter. Maybe forgiveness isn't a moment, but a process. One that starts the day you stop running from the wreckage and start learning how to rebuild. I didn't know if I'd see him again. But I knew the story wasn't over. There was still one truth left waiting, buried beneath the weight of years. A truth that would finally show me what Rafiq had meant all along when he said machines and men break the same way. The morning after I left the scrapyard, the world felt different, quieter, but in a way that made every sound sharper. The rumble of buses, the distant clang of construction, even the flutter of pigeons on electric wires, all of it carried the pulse of a city that never stopped fixing what it broke. I walked through it with Rafiq's words echoing in my head, trying to understand what he really meant about forgiveness, about rebuilding. Somewhere between the noise and the silence, I realized that what he'd taught me wasn't just how to mend engines, but how to see the cracks in things, the fault lines that make people human. Days turned into weeks, and I threw myself into work like a man trying to find redemption in grease and bolts. Every car that came into the shop felt like a message. Some were loud and demanding, others barely alive, sputtering out their last breath before surrendering to my hands. And every time I turned the ignition and heard the smooth hum of life returning, I thought of Rafiq, of how he used to listen, really listen. As if machines spoke a language only broken men could hear, I started saving money. Not much, but enough to buy tools of my own, to maybe one day open a place, not big, not fancy, just mine. A garage where silence was allowed, where every engine was treated like a story waiting to be told. I decided to name it Rafiq's Way, not as a tribute, but as a reminder that some legacies aren't built with fame or fortune, but with the quiet discipline of those who keep fixing things no one else believes can be fixed. Then, one afternoon, while sorting through old parts at the market, I saw a familiar face in the crowd. Not Rafiq this time, but one of the men from that night. His scar was still there, slicing across his jaw like a permanent reminder of violence. My heart froze. He noticed me too. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he turned and disappeared into the maze of stalls. I followed. I didn't know why. Maybe I wanted answers, or maybe I wanted closure. Either way, the chase pulled me deeper into the narrow alleys until the world became a blur of shadows and noise. Finally, I cornered him near the back of an abandoned warehouse. He raised his hands slowly, smirking. "Didn't think I'd see you again," he said. "You and that old man caused a lot of trouble. Where is he?" I demanded. He shrugged. "Gone, just like before. That man doesn't know how to stay put. Always trying to fix things he broke years ago." "What did he owe you?" I asked, my voice trembling more than I wanted. He studied me for a moment, then chuckled softly. "You think it was about money?" He stepped closer, his eyes glinting. "He took something that wasn't his, a car once. But not just any car. It belonged to someone powerful. He rebuilt it, made it his masterpiece. When he refused to give it back, they came for him. He thought he could buy his way out. He was wrong. Something in me shifted. I realized then that the fire, the running, the guilt, it had all begun with the same thing that drove Rafik his whole life: pride in his craft. He hadn't stolen for greed. He'd stolen because he couldn't let perfection die in someone else's hands. The man leaned closer, his voice low. "Tell him this if you see him again. Some things aren't meant to be fixed." Then he turned and vanished into the alley, leaving me alone with a truth that burned hotter than any flame. I went back to the scrapyard that night, the city lights fading behind me. Rafik was there as if he'd been waiting. I told him what I'd heard, and he didn't deny it. He just nodded, eyes distant. "That car," he said softly, "was the last thing my brother and I built together. When he left, they came for me. They wanted the car, not the man. But when you pour your soul into something, it stops being a machine. It becomes a part of you. So I ran." He led me to the back of the yard where, under a tarp, half covered in dust and rust, stood the car. Even in its decay, it was beautiful. The lines were sharp, the frame heavy with history. I could almost see the two brothers working on it, laughing, arguing, dreaming. "I come here every night," Rafik said. "I tell myself I'll finish it. That maybe when it runs again, I'll finally stop running too." I placed my hand on the hood, feeling the cold metal vibrate faintly in the night breeze. "Then let's finish it," I said. He looked at me, surprise flickering across his face. For a moment, I thought he'd refuse. But then he smiled, a real smile this time, and nodded. We worked through the night. The hours melted away, replaced by the rhythm of tools, the scent of oil, and the pulse of something that felt like rebirth. The engine resisted at first, coughing like an old man fighting for breath, but slowly, under our hands, it began to find its voice. When it finally roared to life, the sound wasn't just mechanical. It was human. It was forgiveness turned into motion. Rafik stepped back, tears glinting in his eyes. "She's home," he whispered. I looked at him, and for the first time, I saw not a broken man, but a whole one. A week later, the scrapyard was empty. Rafik was gone again. This time he didn't leave a note. Only the car remained, parked under the fading sun, keys in the ignition. I knew what it meant. He'd finished what he started, and now it was my turn. I drove that car out of the yard, the road stretching endlessly ahead. The engine hummed beneath me, smooth and strong, carrying not just me but every lesson, every silence, every piece of the man who'd taught me how to rebuild what life had tried to destroy. And somewhere in that hum, in the steady rhythm of gears and pistons, I heard Rafik's voice again, quiet, patient, eternal. Machines and men break the same way, but both can live again if someone cares enough to fix them. The road ahead was long, but this time I wasn't running. I was driving toward something, toward who I was meant to become.